Sojourn 6640 AD, sitting upon a mossy boulder under the silvery light of the Orkney moon. New World Order Director Parington Levens took time away from his ponderous thoughts to marvel at his surrounds. Orkney. It was a series of islands off the north coast of Scotland that housed some of the world's nicest towns. At least as far as he was concerned. Orkney, however, had also been home to a long-lost Neolithic civilization. Abandoned and forgotten, its ruins lay either ignored or buried for millennia. By the end of the second millennium AD, these sites slowly re-emerged to become a moderately famous tourist attraction. Some millennia later again, and the Neolithic structures of Orkney had been forgotten once again. With dozens of thriving planets and several hundred colonized moons to explore, the human race was simply overspoiled for choice when it came to tourist destinations. It suited the director just fine. He had just spent the last couple days living in secret in the Neolithic and perfectly restored coastal town of Skara Brae. Though officially on a protected World Heritage List, the site of stone-built homes and green grass had over the centuries been rebuilt back to its original glory. Perhaps glory was overstating things, but the Neolithic town was comfortable enough for those content to live the simple life. It had enjoyed a brief return to civilization during the 5th millennium but fell into disuse again soon after that. Basically, Skara Brae had become the town people live in when they wished to conduct secret experiments upon the east-lying ring of Brodgar. Had the original settlers of the land constructed the not-too-distant ring of Brodgar as a means of making life in their chosen part of the world more bearable? Or had they purposefully sought out the mystical nexus the ring seemed to sit upon from the outset, then built their civilization around it? Or were they completely unaware of its mystical properties or perhaps incapable of unlocking them? Chances were none would ever know. It was too fanciful to believe that people of the 4th millennium before Christ could have possessed knowledge so great as to seek out or fabricate a cross-dimensional nexus such as the ring sat upon. But the ring of Brodgar stood nevertheless. Biting on his lower lip in anxiousness, the director wondered if even the druids of Orkney's long-ago heyday had ever to deal with a dilemma such as he faced. Grasping the crystal-topped staff that had been leaning across his knee, the director rose to his feet. Whatever his decision might prove to be, he would have to make it on the move. The stars were almost aligned, and the ring of Brodgar was an hour's march away. It was vital he should come to be standing at its center when the star bridge shone. Though the moonlight was sufficient, the director blinked hard twice and switched to night vision by means of a very common surgical enhancement, just one of a million wonders humanity had devised by the 7th millennium AD. Smiling, he wondered what the world might think if it was to learn the origins of one of the most important discoveries of all. For it was in the year 4666 AD, the very place he was heading, that mankind stumbled upon the secret of how to build the wormhole-sustaining gates that allowed the rapid expansion of its interstellar civilization. Perhaps the druids of old were indeed space travelers themselves. But as far as top-secret files were concerned, the secrets of the cross-dimensional nexus at the Ring of Brodgar had been uncovered by the New World Order in the 5th millennium. Just 1,000 years later, and an intergalactic transport network had been established, allowing instantaneous travel across thousands of light years between hundreds of colonies. Human civilization had achieved true greatness, and though the official credit went to a fictitious research department, it was all because of the Ring of Brodgar, or as known thereafter by those with high enough security credentials, Brodgar's Gate. What few else in civilization knew was that with the hard-won Neowen crystal atop his staff, the director could employ the ancient gate not only to travel through the vast expanses of space in an instant, but as yet unproved, through time itself. And thus his dilemma. Would he let the tragic future he witnessed while visiting the oracles of Delphi in Greece unfold and simply travel across the stars to somewhere safe, or would he go about changing it? His visit to the oracles had been made in hope of finding a solution to the current state of world affairs. The ongoing Third Colonial War had finally resulted in a Fourth World War upon Earth. The New World Order had once ruled all humanity. Now the fast-crumbling NWO he governed barely controlled Europe. It was all over, and yet, the oracles showed him not a way to go back in time to fix such things, but a time in the distant future apparently far more perilous to the survival of mankind. It was hard to fathom that there could ever eventuate a worse time for the human race than the immediate present. But the oracles were seldom proved wrong. And so he found himself on some strange mystical quest rather than on board some luxurious NWO stellar flagship. Taking in the quiet landscape about him while maintaining his brisk pace, the director spared a thought for the Neolithic civilization that had once resided about the Orkney Isles. What a harsh yet spiritually rich life they must have led. The sheer devotion to astronomy and all manner of mystical arts their culture displayed suggested that they were a society of great intellect. Though their construction seemed simplistic, they all performed the task they had been set for. Indeed, Brodgar's gate still stood, exactly where it was set some 10,000 years earlier. Hard-to-fault builders whose works had outlasted the pyramids of Egypt. Cresting a hill, the director imagined spying a glimpse of the faraway lights of Kirkwall, the mainland's last truly inhabited city. While perhaps a somber-looking place at first glance, it was in fact a hive of high culture. Taverns, theaters, guild halls, and all manner of museums and art galleries littered the place, not to mention the preservation of dozens of second and third millennium structures. Among them was the Earl's Palace. Restored back in 2400 AD, it was now a high-class lodging estate and one of the most entertaining places the director had ever stayed in. Medieval banquets, balls, and intrigue were to be had, not to mention some fascinating displays of swordplay and archery, even some jousting to the ire of some locals. The director stopped a moment and sighed. How he hoped Kirkwall would stand the test of time he was about to embark upon, that it wouldn't be destroyed in the current wars or simply end up abandoned or underwater. So much of what he was about to try was insane. He was trusting in the near-arcane musings of a group of pseudo-scientists. Was he equally mad? Or were they all pioneers? Geniuses? One way or the other he was soon to find out. Eventually, the director could see the first hints of the tall stone slabs protruding from the ground like a circular array of medieval guard towers. Though he had amidst the company of his research team visited the cairn several times prior, the sense of awe the director felt upon his latest approach was undiminished. The place was majestic. The circle itself was just over 100 meters wide. Those 60 of the tall stone markers about the circumference of the ring would have stood originally, now just 26 still stood. While other wondrous connotations existed for the original presence of 60 stones, what his team had been fixated upon was the sustainability of the time gate. His team had discussed whether there existed any necessity to somehow restore the site to its original complement of stones, by way of remanufacture or even relocating some of those from nearby Stennis. But it was concluded that just one column needed be standing so long as the ritual to open the gate was completed within the vicinity of the original circle's center. The tall stone slabs were in effect anchors, the outer and inner limits of the wormhole that would eventuate. The nature of a wormhole, as NWO science had it, was that it was always trying to collapse upon itself. Though the gate could function with just one such stone in place, such was the nature of the arcane science at play, that if that stone were to fall while a traveler was journeying through the wormhole, that traveler would be crushed into nothingness as the wormhole collapsed upon itself. The chances of that were minuscule but all too possible. Though the manufactured wormhole gates currently in use across human civilization never reported travel time being anything much more than instantaneous, the director was about to attempt to travel through folded time, not just space. That 26 anchors still remained seemed a tolerable allowance for spares. Blinking back his natural vision, the director took in his now more eerie and at once more spectacular surrounds. How he loved Orkney. Reaching the small marker stone this team had carefully placed at the circle's exact center, the director got to work. He was apparently several minutes early and was thus able to set up calmly. Placing down his staff before removing his backpack and laying it on the damp grass next to it, he then fumbled with its straps a while before retrieving a sturdy plastic container. Opening it, he checked the atomic clock within for functionality. It was as expected, still in working order, and so he set the face to 0 and replaced it within the plastic container and snapped it shut. Overturning a small nearby chunk of stone, he dug a small hole into the dirt in which he placed the container. He then replaced the chunk of stone in its original place before scooping away any signs of tampering. Taking in a deep breath of air, the director then rebuckled and redonned his backpack before checking his own wristwatch. It also was in good working order. 2 minutes ago, he had cut it rather close. Stooping down to reclaim his staff, the director felt his back twinge and grimaced. It was an old malaise, one that afflicted him now and again with a dull and persistent pain, almost as a reminder that despite his many powers, he was a mere mortal. Shaking away his wandering thoughts, he brought himself to be standing directly upon the small central marker stone of the Brodgar gate. Mentally preparing himself for what might be his last few ever breaths, the director looked up at the stars and the moon before thrusting his staff up high overhead. As if knowing it was in the right place, the Noan crystal quickly began to glow, catching all manner of present light and turning it inwards and out upon its many facets. The crystal's many edges also took to shine in the form of a marching sequence of prismatic hues, bright and beautiful even if only powered by soft moonlight. Checking his wristwatch, it was time. Bringing the tip of the staff crashing down between his feet, the director shouted one word as it struck the stone, "Brodgar." There was a flash, and then the director was gone. Panic gripped the director. He couldn't breathe. Everything was wrong. Whereas gating through space by means of a wormhole always seemed instantaneous, whether by a modern space gate or something as archaic as Brodgar's Gate, Stonehenge, or the amphitheater of Delphi, what the director now experienced boggled his mind. It was not something he could have prepared for. He was falling. It was in no way in particular, but he was falling and falling fast. As he fell, he could feel a curious nibbling impacting through his clothes and upon his skin. While at first the visual feast on offer about him took precedence amongst his senses, falling or perhaps spiraling through a brilliant cosmic kaleidoscope as he was, eventually that nibbling at his skin seemed to sharpen and become all-permeating as if every atom of his being was starting to vibrate or perhaps tear apart. The staff in his hand at one stage almost shook loose, and it was this that drew the director's attention to the Noan crystal atop it. Gripping the staff tightly as was humanly possible, the notion assailing him that to drop it would forever doom him to whatever void he was in, the director turned it slightly one way then the other. Every facet of the crystal seemed to be glowing a different hue. As he spiraled further and faster through the cosmic kaleidoscope, he realized two things. That if he continued as was, he would be ripped apart well before he got the chance to asphyxiate, and that many of the colors around him seemed to coincide with those within the crystal. Surmising their relationship to each other was something more than just reflection. He realized that though the colors were the same, those about the crystal's facets remained fixed and constant, while those about the cosmic kaleidoscope danced about maniacally. Desperate now as his lungs ached and his very teeth began to rattle on the verge of breaking, the director held his staff in both hands as one might a halberd, chose to tilt outwards a facet of red, and then started ramming it against the cosmic kaleidoscope's whirling walls back and forth until such time as he managed to strike a spot of light-colored red. To the director's astonishment, the staff passed through so easily he almost lost hold of it for lack of expected resistance. At the same time, all sensation of movement and vibration ceased. He was no longer falling through a mad cosmic kaleidoscope but suddenly floating in place, an endless and wondrous cylinder of countless segments of vibrant prismatic colors stretching and disappearing beneath him. Way below. Then the strangest thing he had ever seen occurred. Guessing that to withdraw the staff from whatever wall it had breached would catapult him back to his previous predicament, he instead moved it to one side. The staff seemed to drag a section of wall with it, hence creating a tear through which he could see a warm red glow. Then it struck the director what was occurring. Science readily agreed that time travel was unsustainable, that anything trying to undo time would first undo itself. His team's research had led him to believe that the Noan crystal in conjunction with Brodgar's Gate would somehow circumvent the theories. Perhaps their suppositions were correct, if in an abstract way. It seemed that traveling through time in one's own dimension was extremely hazardous and limited. He was trying to travel forward many thousands of years and had waited for such stars and planets to align as would provide such a result. Perhaps one could travel a short distance of time within their own dimension. Perhaps not. But what the director had just discovered was that the Noan crystal's purpose was not only to cast you through time, but to allow you to cross dimensions as you did. Smiling even as the tear seemed to slowly close back around his staff, he knew what to do. With the crystal head still embedded, the director drew a wide circle and hence opened a large circular tear. He was immediately dragged through. He was falling again, and before long the red wormhole turned into much the same kaleidoscope he had been falling through earlier. But with one not-so-subtle difference. The vibrations, the nibbling at his skin, the sensation that he was about to be torn asunder were all absent. There was still no air, however. He journeyed in an almost surreal manner, contemplating just where he may have ended up if he had quickly opened another portal into this new wormhole. It was still red. Maybe another world or plane of existence? Perhaps hell? His burning lungs, however, stole away his meanderings. Wondering if was destined simply to die for a lack of oxygen, the director finally found himself coming to a slow halt to arrive standing upon a solid circular platform, itself a myriad of prismatic segmentation, rather like a gigantic circular stained glass window laid flat upon the ground. The marvelous platform he stood upon seemed some 100 meters wide, and when his eyes trailed along to one side he saw 26 tall shapes standing as black silhouettes against the brilliant kaleidoscope-like background of the wormhole he was in. Relief struck the director as he realized exactly where he was. His journey was at an end. Tempted to try and select a dimension other than his own, The director ruled against such experimentation and once again employed the red facet upon his Noan crystal. Finding an appropriately colored spot upon the ground before him, he thrust the tip of the staff down and about in a circle and found himself immediately drawn through the makeshift portal. A strange flash and perhaps wind erupted about him a moment, and then all was calm again. He stood at Brodgar's gate in nearly the same exact position he had been in when first he had begun his journey. Nearly. That in itself was food for thought, but perhaps at a later time, because now, finally, he could breathe. Gulping greedily at the air, the director laughed with glee. He had survived. Glancing at his watch, only a single minute had elapsed. Loosing the nearby rock, he reclaimed his plastic container and found the atomic clock within. Everything looked as he had left it prior to leaving, and the director was starting to wonder if he had simply spent a minute traveling through God knew what to end up just that minute into the future. The very time-space he would have been in regardless had he never left. The clock read 2,720 years and some change. He was standing at Brodgar's gate as it stood, almost completely unchanged, in the year 9360 AD. He had work to do.